Prejudice and Pride is a really interesting and fascinating insight into the world of Indian cinema filmmaking, but also why it's important for both filmmakers, actors, and its connection audiences.
What struck me when I got to the end of the film, apart from I enjoyed it enormously, was that it's very much an argument. It's a development of ideas across the course of the running time. In some ways a little like a PhD, but much more accessible to a general audience, and I think that's its strength. It's got a powerful argument, it's well made, and it's accessible.
So I think the film was like a great contribution to the academic writing on Indian cinema, but in a more visual, accessible manner. I think especially sort of appeals to the younger audience, which we are more used to visual presentations of everything, and we find it easier to relate to. And it was especially interesting to find a text about Indian cinema made by an academic also appealing to other academics.
What is very beautiful about this particular film is the narrative component is entirely built through the interviews and the clips. And that I think is quite stunning, and the editing of this film is fantastic. I also particularly like the way that Piyush uses the quotes, which are really an extension of the interview narrative to move between subtopics. That was very beautiful.
There is so much intellectual content in this film because you're dealing also with philosophy that's happening at the back end about how these films are coming to the foreground, what is shaping this kind of thinking. So you're asking a very in a way a very decolonial question is being put across, that why is it not considered and who decides what is what should be the contours of good filmmaking and what is not, and why should we all subscribe to one way of making film, which is the whole which the people in the documentary talk about, the masculinist Western way of making films, the quiet, reserved kind of filmmaking. So I think that inherently showcases that there is a politics in the documentary. You cannot avoid it at any point of time, and I don't think you are trying to avoid it either. You are trying to take that question head on.
I really enjoyed this movie. This movie shows how Indian movie is different, has its own culture, has its own identity. I would definitely recommend this movie to any students who would want to learn about Indian cinema, or anybody really interested in Indian movie and how they are different.
The way it has used the interviews and perspectives of different people all over the world and put in the montages of Indian classics to validate and to actually make the viewer aware of all the different tidbits of Indian films has made the documentary a very compelling watch.
The film does justice to all the ranges of Indian cinema, and the one thing that stood out to me when I was thinking about this movie, it grows on you once you've watched it and you're thinking about it and you're talking to your friends and family about this.
I want to congratulate Piyush for making this film. In my view, it's a beautiful, beautiful collage of so many different influences.
I've never had the opportunity to have such a macro understanding of Bollywood cinema and indeed Indian cinema before. My understanding has always been quite restricted, almost hierarchical in the ways in which I've been talking and taught about it. But watching that film, watching the documentary, I found that I was able to contextualize some of the much wider debates, and that in turn allowed me to question more of what I thought I knew and where I think the study of Bollywood cinema should be going. Questions surrounding gender, questions surrounding canon and canonization, the very nature of how we understand and classify Indian cinema. So I think that this film actually has much wider, much broader implications, not just for the study of cinema, but for cultural studies, for the humanities in general, and in terms of questioning what we know about canon, particularly, frankly, white canon. This allows us to decentralize, decolonize to some extent the curriculum with which we are working, in which we are working. And that enables us to ask much more pertinent questions in a much more intelligent way.